Rose Conway-Walsh.
Today, third level students across the state are staging a walkout from lectures, and I send solidarity and support to these students and to their families, and I want to acknowledge the work done by USI and all of the students' unions. Students are weary and they're at their wits' end, and this is not a decision that they've taken lightly. They've been forced into it by your government's abject failure to stand up for students. Students are really under pressure. Too many are sleeping in cars, on sofas, or commuting exhausting journeys because there simply isn't enough accommodation. PhD researchers are pushed to the brink of their finances without a living wage or decent conditions. SUSI grants are in dire need of reform. Tánaiste, the student housing crisis should shame your government. The whole calamity about this is that the number of students needing accommodation are entirely predictable. It's not good enough for government ministers to act surprised every September, and indeed it's apt that the walkout today was at 11:11 because your party has been in government for 11 years, and each of those years it has gotten worse. Despite all of the hand-wringing from government TDs, this year's budget is the third consecutive budget from this government with no allocation for student accommodation. The Fine Gael Minister for Further and Higher Education has passed the buck to the Fianna Fáil Minister for Housing. A Minister for Housing who has not even met with student representatives to discuss the crisis. Someone needs to take responsibility. Students are paying the price each and every day. Let me tell you what the government's failure to deliver student accommodation means for ordinary students. One student told me, being unable to secure accommodation has meant I must commute 2.5 hours each way. My mental health has suffered immensely due to anxiety. Another told us, I commute 6 hours a day to reach UCD from Offaly. I know lads travelling from Longford daily. I am weary. I am in my final year, but I cannot face it. I'm deferring. A PhD researcher said, out of the $1,500 per month stipend, $1,000 each month goes towards accommodation. I'm left eating beans and toast for all meals. My mental health has been severely impacted and I'm considering quitting my programme and leaving the country. The housing crisis your government has caused is devastating people's lives and impacting on student education. But it doesn't have to be this way. We need capital investment to unlock the 3,000 student college-owned beds that this government have allowed to sit on the shelf. This must happen without delay. Sinn Féin allocated 81 million in additional capital investment to get these shovel-ready projects on site and under construction. Tánaiste, will you commit to allocating the necessary investment? Students and parents must be recognised as renters like any other, yet they're being unfairly excluded from the rent tax rebate. Will you find a way to include them in the rent tax credit? PhD researchers are currently also excluded because they're denied worker status. Will you end this unfairness and include them in this rebate? Students have been failed for far too long on your government's watch. Will you end this unfairness, Tánaiste, and tackle the student crisis once and for all to let the students of this country get on with their education and get on with their careers that they need to? Too many people are being excluded. When I talk to universities and colleges, they tell me about the hundreds of students that are waiting for their accommodation, waiting on the list, and that doesn't even include the students who haven't even left their homes or decided to defer until next year. This is totally wrong on so many levels. Students need the support of this government.
Thanks, Deputy. The rise in the cost of living is affecting everyone, and it's affecting students too. We understand that, we get that. Students want their voices heard, and by protesting today, they're making sure that their voices are heard, and their voices will be heard in this House and by this government. Just to give you a few examples of what we've announced only in the past few weeks, a reduction in college fees by €1,000 this year and €500 on a permanent basis next year. And we intend to build on that in the years ahead. Student grants, there'll be a one-off increase in the student grant before Christmas, putting more money back in students' pockets, a 10 to 14% increase in the student grant from January, and eligibility for the student grant is being widened so that about 15,000 more students who don't currently qualify for a grant will qualify for one next year. We've also reduced the cost of public transport for students by up to 50%, and there will be more purpose-built student accommodation being built in the next months and years. So 4 things that we're doing to help students with the cost of living: cutting the student fee, increasing the student grant, reducing the cost of public transport, and building more purpose-built student accommodation, which is desperately needed, as you rightly point out. I think it is worth saying that we have more students in Ireland now than ever before. That's a really positive thing. This generation of young people, of school leavers, are more likely to receive a third-level education, more likely to receive higher education or further education than any generation that has gone before them. They're also more likely to be in employment, and as we know from migration statistics, more Irish citizens return every year than leave, and that's been the case for a number of years. But yes, like all sectors of society, students are really suffering when it comes to the impact of the housing crisis and very high rents, and we absolutely acknowledge that. In relation to the question that you raised on student accommodation, Minister Harris is taking the lead on this. He has the authority of government to take the lead on this, in cooperation, of course, with Minister O'Brien. There are hundreds of student accommodation places under construction at the moment, 600 alone, not too far away from you, in the University of Galway. And Minister Harris is putting together a financial package to help unlock student accommodation developments where permission is granted but they can't proceed because they're not financially viable. And he is putting together financial aid for universities, for technological universities as well, to unlock those developments and get them under construction within the next year. And that will really help by providing more purpose-built student accommodation on campus. And that must be done at affordable rates as well, because a lot of the student accommodation that exists, particularly in this city, is extremely expensive. In relation to the rent tax credit, as you know, that's a credit of €500 a year per renter, not per tenancy. So if 3 or 4 students are sharing a house, or 3 or 4 people are sharing a house, it's up to €2,000. That does apply to students where they are income taxpayers, but we acknowledge that in many cases students don't earn enough to pay income tax, and their parents are paying the rent for them. So Minister Donoghue is examining whether it's possible to extend the rent tax credit to parents who pay student fees on behalf of their children. We hope we can do that. Sometimes these things are easier promised than done, but we hope we can do that, and we should be in a position to confirm whether or not we can do that by next Tuesday when the Finance Bill comes to Cabinet.
Okay, thank you, Taoiseach, and I do welcome that. Minister Harris is in the Dáil here answering questions the next week, and I hope that he will acknowledge that, because parents paying for their students' rent should be entitled to. Rent is rent at the end of the day. I think the disappointing thing about this, though, Minister, is that we know for babies born today, we know how many students are going to need accommodation. We can predict with very accurate ability how many students are going to need accommodation in 20 years' time and 19 years' time. So I think there has to be an acknowledgement of the failure that's there. We have to learn from that. But the investment that's needed, it's inevitable that there has to be a capital investment to make the 3,000 plus beds financially viable, and that needs to be done sooner rather than later. This government is very good at looking at things, but I would ask for immediate action on behalf of the students who are out protesting today, and I want to acknowledge the great work that they have done in that regard and standing up for students. But we here in this House must stand up for students. We must hear what they are saying. Their families are under pressure, and they are under pressure, and it has to stop.
Well done.
Thanks, Deputy. I'm not sure that's entirely true. If we did rewind 20 years ago, when neither my party nor your party was in government, and we projected ahead, I doubt we would have projected that the population of the country would be what it is now, 5.2 million. And I doubt we would have projected that we would extend the opportunity of higher and further education to so many people as we do now. More people, thankfully, accessing higher and further education than ever was the case before, from a wider and more diverse range of backgrounds, particularly non-traditional backgrounds, than ever was the case before. Those are really good things, but it has resulted in a shortage of student accommodation. We acknowledge that. We have to deal with that. One of the ways we're going to deal with it is by providing financial aid to universities, to technology universities, to unlock some of those purpose-built student accommodation developments so they can go ahead. And Minister Harris is working on that as we speak.